The laughter didn't hurt as much as the dismissal. It wasn't the sound of men mocking me that stung. It was the sound of leadership failing, the hollow, echoing thud of authority rotting from the inside out. I stood rigid in the center of the tactical operations center, the air conditioning humming a low, artificial drone that did nothing to cut the thick, oily tension in the room. My report lay on the metal desk, a stack of papers filled with thermal readings, patrol logs, and a handwritten analysis of the valley's changing acoustics. Lieutenant Vance didn't even pick it up. He just leaned back in his ergonomic command chair, his boots resting near the edge of my work, and smirked. That smirk was a weapon. It was a signal to everyone else in the room, the radio operators, the supply sergeant, the runners, that I was fair game, that I was the court jester in a kingdom of blind men. So, let me get this straight, Vance said, his voice dripping with a casual arrogance, the kind that, only comes from a man who hasn't felt the concussion of a near miss in years. You think the enemy is moving heavy artillery through the Devil's Gorge? The same gorge that intel, actual intel, from satellites, not a private's imagination, says has been clear for 3 months? You think they're doing this invisibly without a single heat signature, just because you, felt it in your knees? A ripple of chuckles went through the room, sharp and jagged. I didn't flinch, though I felt the heat rising up the back of my neck. I kept my eyes locked on the tactical map behind him, a pristine digital display that showed a sea of comforting, false green. Not my knees, sir. The birds. The wildlife patterns have shifted 3 miles east in the last 48 hours, and the ground tremors on the seismic sensors. They aren't geological. They're rhythmic. That's heavy machinery moving at night, under cloud cover, dampened treads, low gear. Vance laughed then, a sharp, barking sound that stripped me of my uniform and left me standing there as just a nuisance. Birds. We're basing base security on bird migration now? Listen to yourself. You're paranoid. You've been out in the heat too long, soldier. You're seeing ghosts where there are only shadows. He flicked his hand, dismissing me like a stray dog begging for scraps. Get out of my office and take your fairy tales with you. If I hear you spreading this panic to the platoon, I'll have you up for insubordination. I'll strip that stripe off your chest so fast you'll bleed. I grabbed the papers. My knuckles were white, straining against the skin. I could feel the eyes of the other men on my back, heavy with judgment and amusement. I turned and walked out, the sound of their laughter following me down the corridor, echoing off the corrugated metal walls like a chorus of the damned. They thought it was a joke. They thought I was cracking up. But as I stepped out into the blinding sunlight of Camp Ironwood, looking toward the ridgeline that loomed over us like a massive, jagged tombstone, I didn't feel paranoid. I felt a cold, heavy certainty in the pit of my stomach. They could laugh all they wanted, but the enemy wasn't laughing. The enemy was loading. Camp Ironwood was a dust bowl, a forgotten outpost on the edge of a conflict the world had stopped watching on the news. It was a place where complacency went to thrive. We were supposed to be holding a strategic supply line, but the sector had been quiet for 6 months. Too quiet. The silence wasn't peace. It was a breath being held. The routine had set in like rot. Soldiers walked around with their helmets unstrapped, hanging off their gear like fashion accessories. Patrols cut corners, skipping the difficult climbs to smoke cigarettes in the shade of the rocks. The perimeter guards spent more time scrolling through cached videos on their phones than scanning the horizon. It was the kind of atmosphere that breeds disaster, and Lieutenant Vance was the architect of that laziness. He was a man who cared more about the creases in his uniform and the quality of his coffee than the readiness of his defense. I was the anomaly. I was the buzzkill, the guy who checked the wire twice, who cleaned his rifle 3 times a day until the metal gleamed. To them, I was a walking anxiety attack. I spent my downtime in the comms shack, listening to the static, looking for patterns in the white noise. I watched the ridgeline while they played cards. I was isolated, not by a physical wall, but by a wall of indifference. My bunk was in the corner, and lately, the space around it had grown. People stopped sitting near me in the mess hall. Conversation died when I entered the room. I had become the base eccentric, the boy who cried wolf before I had even really screamed. Corporal Hayes was the only one who would still look me in the eye, but even he was drifting away, pulled by the gravity of the group. Hayes was a good kid, young, with a picture of his fiancée taped to the inside of his helmet. He was neutral, trying to survive his tour without making waves, trying to be invisible. He sat across from me that evening in the chow hall, pushing processed eggs around his plate. The noise of the cafeteria was loud, shouting, joking, the clatter of trays. It felt like a high school cafeteria, not a forward operating base in hostile territory. "You really told Vance about the birds?" Hayes asked quietly, not looking up. He sounded tired, like he was exhausted by my mere existence. "It's not just the birds, Hayes," I said, my voice low, leaning in. "It's the silence. The valley breathes. You know that. At night, you hear the wind, the insects, the distant shifting of rock. For 2 nights it's been dead silent. Nature doesn't shut up unless a predator is walking through it." Hayes sighed, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "Look, man, I believe that you believe it, but you gotta chill. Vance is gunning for you. He's telling people you're unstable. He told squad leader Miller that you're suffering from acute combat stress. If you keep pushing this, he's gonna section you, send you back home with a discharge that says you lost your mind. You want that on your record?" "I'd rather be discharged than dead," I replied, taking a sip of the lukewarm water. "And I'd rather be called crazy than watch this base get leveled." Hayes shook his head, finally making eye contact. There was pity in his eyes. That was worse than the anger. Pity meant he thought I was gone. It meant he was already mourning the man I used to be. "Just keep your head down, please, for your own sake. Don't make me testify against you at a hearing." He stood up and left, leaving his tray half full. I sat alone in the noise, listening to the laughter of men who had no idea that the silence outside the walls was getting louder every hour. I looked at the windows, reinforced with cheap wire mesh. It wouldn't stop shrapnel. It wouldn't stop anything. The base was a soft target, a ripe fruit waiting to be plucked, and I was the only one who could see the hand reaching for it. The turning point came 3 days later. I was on a dusk patrol, unauthorized, skirting the edge of the permitted zone. The sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in bruised purples and blood reds. I had hiked up a ridge overlooking the eastern approach, the Devil's Gorge. Vance was so sure was empty. I had my own binoculars, high-powered optics I'd bought with my own money because the standard issue gear was scratched to hell. I lay in the dirt, the heat radiating off the rocks baking my chest, and waited. For an hour, nothing, just the shimmering heat haze. Then, a glimmer. It was faint, just a momentary reflection of the dying sun off metal, deep in the shadow of the canyon. I held my breath, adjusting the focus wheel with trembling fingers. There it was again. Movement. Unnatural geometry. Nature doesn't make straight lines. I saw the barrel of a mortar tube being adjusted beneath a thermal camouflage net. Then another. Then the distinct silhouette of a spotter moving into position, checking a rangefinder. They weren't just passing through. They were digging in. They were triangulating our coordinates. They were setting up a kill box, designed to overlap fire right on top of the barracks. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. This wasn't a suspicion anymore. This was actionable intelligence. I scrambled backward, sliding down the shale, ignoring the sharp rocks cutting into my palms. I moved as fast as I could without giving away my position, lungs burning, legs pumping. I ran the 2 miles back to the perimeter, the taste of iron in my throat. I burst into the command post, covered in dust, sweat dripping from my nose, my chest heaving. Vance was there, along with the platoon sergeant and a few squad leaders. They were laughing about something, coffee mugs in hand, feet up. The atmosphere was relaxed, jovial. I shattered it. "They're set up," I yelled, gasping for air, almost collapsing against the doorframe. "Grid 47 Alpha, mortar pits, direct line of sight to the barracks." I saw them. I saw the tubes. The room went silent. The laughter died instantly. Vance slowly turned, his face hardening into a mask of annoyance. He didn't look concerned. He looked bored. He looked like I had interrupted a good joke. "You left the perimeter?" Vance asked, his voice dangerously quiet, stepping around the desk. "Sir, I saw the weapons. They are going to fire. We need to scramble the QRF. We need to sound the alarm and get everyone into the hardened shelters." "I asked you a question, soldier." Vance slammed his hand on the table, the sound cracking like a whip. "Did you leave your assigned post to go ghost hunting again?" I went to verify the threat because no one else would. I shouted back, desperation stripping away my military bearing. "They are there. 4 tubes. Heavy caliber. They aren't moving. They are aiming. We have maybe hours, maybe less. We are sitting ducks." Vance walked up to me, invading my personal space. He smelled of expensive cologne and stale coffee. "You are a liability. You abandoned your post. You are spreading hysteria based on hallucinations. I have had reports from drone surveillance an hour ago. The sector is clear. You are contradicting military intelligence with your delusions. The drones missed it. They're under thermal nets. Look at the logs. I shoved the paper toward him. He slapped it out of my hand. Enough, Vance roared. He turned to the squad leaders. Look at him. Look at this man. This is what fear looks like. This is what cowardice looks like. He's so afraid of a fight that he's inventing one just to justify his panic. He turned back to me, a cruel smile playing on his lips. You want a bunker so bad? Fine. You're confined to base. But since you're so worried about structural integrity, I'm putting you on detail. You stay away from the ops room. You stay away from the radio. If I hear you say the word attack to one more soul, I will throw you in the brig. Now get out of my sight. I walked out of the command post, but I didn't go to my bunk. I couldn't. The humiliation was a physical weight, pressing down on my shoulders, but beneath it, something fractured. I found an old supply latrine behind the motor pool, a rusted metal box that smelled of bleach and decay. I locked the door and collapsed against it. My hands were shaking so hard, I couldn't unbuckle my helmet. I ripped it off and threw it into the corner. I stared at myself in the cracked mirror bolted to the wall. My eyes were bloodshot, wild. My face was caked in dust and sweat. Maybe he's right. The thought whispered in the back of my mind, terrifying and seductive. Maybe I am losing it. Maybe the silence is just silence. Maybe the glimmer was just the sun playing tricks. I gripped the edges of the sink, my knuckles turning white. I dry heaved, nothing coming up but bile. I felt a sob build in my chest, a jagged thing made of exhaustion and shame. I let it out, a single choked sound that no one would hear. I splashed cold water on my face, again and again, trying to wash away the doubt. I looked at the water swirling down the drain. If I was crazy, then I was crazy. But if I was right, everyone I knew was going to die. I looked at my reflection one last time. The fear was still there, but the shaking had stopped. If I'm crazy, I whispered to the empty room, then building a wall won't hurt anyone. But if I'm sane, that wall is the only thing that matters. I wiped my face. I put my helmet back on. I walked out into the night. I was done talking. There was an old supply bunker on the south side of the compound. It was a relic from a previous occupation, half-buried, forgotten, used mostly to store rusted tools and broken furniture. The roof was cracked. The sandbags around it were rotted, spilling sand like hourglasses counting down time. It wasn't safe. Not yet. I spent the next 3 days in purgatory. The platoon treated me like a leper. When I walked by, conversations stopped. I heard the whispers. Paranoid, crazy, cracked up. Someone taped a tinfoil hat to my locker. I left it there. I didn't have the energy to be angry. I needed that energy for the shovel. Every night, after my assigned duties, I went to the old bunker. I worked in the dark, using only the moonlight and a red lens flashlight held in my teeth. I stole empty sandbags from the supply depot. I filled them, one by one. Heavy, gritty work. The nylon bags tore the skin off my fingers. My back screamed in protest. My muscles twitched with fatigue. I dragged them to the bunker, stacking them against the south wall, the side, facing the gorge. I reinforced the roof with timber I scavenged from the scrap pile, wedging thick beams under the sagging concrete. I cleared out the junk inside, sweeping the floor, checking the ventilation. One night, Hayes found me. It was 300. I was hauling a bag of quick-dry cement I'd found, mixing it with water to patch the cracks in the ceiling. Man, you gotta stop, Hayes whispered, standing in the doorway. He looked genuinely distressed, like he was watching a friend self-immolate. Vance sees you doing this. He's gonna think you're building a clubhouse. It looks pathetic. Everyone is talking about you. I didn't stop mixing. It's not a clubhouse, Hayes. It's a tomb, or a womb. Depends on how lucky we get. There's no attack coming, Hayes pleaded, stepping closer. The scouts went out today. They stayed on the road, sure, but they saw nothing. They stayed on the road, I repeated, slapping the wet concrete into a fissure. The enemy is in the rocks. The enemy is patient. Hayes watched me for a long time. He looked at my bleeding hands, the dark circles under my eyes, the frantic precision of my work. Why are you doing this? They hate you. They treat you like garbage. Why are you breaking your back for them? I stopped then. I leaned against the shovel, breathing hard. Because they're wrong, Hayes. Being wrong shouldn't carry a death sentence. Not if I can help it. Hayes shook his head, backing away. You're scaring me. Seriously, when it happens, I said to his retreating back, don't run to the CP, run here. Tell the others. If you have 3 seconds, run here. He didn't answer. He disappeared into the dark. I kept working. I fortified the entrance, creating a blast deflection wall. It wasn't pretty. It was ugly, rough, and amateur, but it was solid. It was the only thing on that base that was real. By the 4th day, the atmosphere on the base had shifted. It was looser, a holiday feeling. Rumors of a rotation were spreading. Guys were talking about home, about beers, about girls. The tension I felt was invisible to them. They were sleepwalking off a cliff. I sat by my bunker, exhausted, watching the sun go down. The ridicule had ceased to matter. I had become a ghost to them. Then, it happened. It didn't start with an explosion. It started with a sound I had been dreading and expecting. A distant thump, thump, thump. Soft, almost like a heartbeat. I stood up. The air around me seemed to freeze. I looked at the watchtower. The guard was lighting a cigarette, the flare of the lighter bright in the dusk. He hadn't heard it. Then came the whistle. It is a sound you never forget. A tearing of the air, a shrieking descent that screams of physics and death. Incoming! I screamed, my voice tearing from my throat. Incoming! Take cover! My voice was swallowed by the earth erupting. The first shell didn't hit the barracks. It hit the generator. The lights died instantly, plunging the base into a gray twilight. The second shell hit the motor pool. A fireball rolled into the sky, illuminating the camp in a strobe light of horror. Then the main barrage landed. It was exactly as I had predicted. They walked the fire across the compound with terrifying precision. The ground shook so hard it knocked me off my feet. Dirt, rocks, and hot metal sprayed the air. The alarm finally began to wail, a mournful, mechanical scream that was barely audible over the thunder of the mortars. Chaos. Absolute, unadulterated chaos. Men were running out of the barracks, half-dressed, screaming, running in circles. There was no leadership. The command post, Vance's fortress of arrogance, took a direct hit on the 4th volley. I scrambled up, grabbing my rifle. Here! I bellowed, waving my arms. To the bunker! Get to the bunker! I saw Hayes. He was stumbling, covered in dust, holding his helmet. He saw me. He saw the reinforced mound of earth I had built while they slept. Recognition flashed in his eyes. Terror mixed with realization. He sprinted toward me, grabbing 2 other guys by the webbing and dragging them. Move! Move! I grabbed the first soldier, throwing him into the darkness of my shelter. The explosions were getting closer. They were walking the fire toward the southern edge. I stood at the entrance, exposed, acting as a beacon. Over here, get inside! More soldiers saw the safety. They came running, a desperate stampede of terrified men. I shoved them in, one by one, packed them in like sardines. The air smelled of sulfur and burning diesel. Just as I turned to follow them in, a scream cut through the roar of the bombardment. It was thin, high-pitched, and desperate. Help! My leg! I looked back. 20 meters away, near the burning wreck of a Humvee, a private named Jenkins was pinned under a fallen beam. He was thrashing, his eyes wide with the kind of fear that breaks a man. I didn't think. I didn't calculate the odds. I ran back out. The air felt solid, vibrating with the force of the explosions. Something hot and incredibly fast hissed past my ear, a razor-sharp kiss of death that sliced my cheek. I barely felt the pain. I dove next to Jenkins, the heat from the fire searing my skin. I got you! I screamed over the noise. I grabbed his vest. Push! I heaved, my back screaming, my veins popping. Jenkins shrieked as I dragged him free. A mortar landed 50 yards away, the shockwave lifting us both off the ground and slamming us back down into the dirt. My mouth filled with grit and blood. I spit it out and scrambled up, grabbing Jenkins by the drag handle. I hauled him like a sack of cement, stumbling, gasping, my lungs burning with smoke, until we fell through the entrance of the bunker. I rolled him to the side and turned back to the door. That was when I saw him, Lieutenant Vance. He had stumbled out of the ruins of the CP. He was missing his cap. His pristine uniform was shredded, dark with blood on one side. He was disoriented, staggering through the smoke like a man waking from a nightmare. He looked up. Through the haze of dust and fire, our eyes locked. Time seemed to stretch. In that split second, there was no rank. There was just the truth. I saw the realization hit him harder than any shrapnel. He looked at the bunker. He looked at the sandbags I had stacked. He looked at me, the paranoid private, the coward, the crazy man, standing safe at the door of the only shelter that would survive. Part of me wanted him to see it. Part of me wanted the satisfaction of him knowing I was right, that my paranoid delusions were the only thing standing between life and death. But looking at his broken face, I realized that war doesn't give you that kind of justice. It doesn't care who was right. "Run!" I screamed at him, reaching out a bloody hand, instinct overriding hatred. "Vance, run!" He took a step toward me. Then the shell landed directly behind him. There was no cinematic speech, no final words. Just a flash of white light and a red mist. The blast wave erased him. He was gone. The arrogance, the dismissal, the authority, vaporized in an instant of violent correction. The concussion wave hit me like a sledgehammer. It lifted me off my feet and threw me backward into the bunker. I slammed into the wall, the world going white and high-pitched. "Seal it!" I screamed, crawling through the dirt, blood pouring from the cut on my cheek. "Seal the door!" Hayes and Miller grabbed the heavy blast door, a door I had greased and repaired 3 nights ago, and slammed it shut. We threw the deadbolt. The world outside ceased to exist. Inside, it was dark, crowded, and terrified. As the ground hammered against us, boom, 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 the bunker groaned. Dust rained down from the ceiling, coating us in gray powder. We were 30 men crammed into a space meant for 10. Suddenly, a sickening crack echoed through the small space. The main support beam, the old timber I had reinforced, splintered. A shower of dirt and rocks poured in from the roof. The ceiling began to sag. "It's coming down!" someone screamed. Panic, sharp and electric, surged through the men. They started to shove, to scramble away from the center, crushing each other against the walls. "No!" I roared, flashing my red light into their faces. "Nobody moves! If you move, the pressure shifts and we all die!" I lunged forward, grabbing a spare steel jack I had scavenged from the motor pool, something I had hidden under a tarp for this exact nightmare scenario. I jammed it under the splintering beam and cranked it. My muscles burned, adrenaline flooding my system. "Hayes, get on the other side!" I yelled. Hayes didn't hesitate. He scrambled over, grabbing the handle with me. We cranked it together, gritting our teeth, sweat stinging our eyes. The jack groaned, metal against wood. The ceiling pushed back, heavy with the weight of the bombardment. "One more turn!" screamed. We heaved. The jack clicked into place. The beam held. The shower of dirt stopped. The panic subsided, replaced by the heavy, ragged breathing of terrified men. I slumped against the cold concrete wall, sliding down until I hit the floor. I shone the light around the room. They were all looking at me. There was no mockery now, no smirks, no rolled eyes. In the claustrophobic red glow, their faces were masks of shock and awe. They looked at the reinforced walls. They looked at the water, bottles stacked in the corner. They looked at the medical kit I had already cracked open to treat Miller's head. They realized all at once that every hour I had spent sweating while they relaxed, every insult I had swallowed, every moment of isolation, it was for this. It was for them. Hayes looked at me. His hands were still shaking from the jack. "Vance," he whispered. "Did you see him?" "I saw him," I said, my voice flat. "He didn't make it." Miller, the squad leader who had called me a coward, stared at the floor. He said it was safe. He swore it was safe. He was wrong, I said, and being wrong gets you killed. We stayed in that bunker for 6 hours. The shelling stopped after 40 minutes, but we didn't move. We waited for the ground assault. I organized a watch rotation at the blast slit. I distributed water. I kept them calm. I was just a private, but in that bunker, I was the only authority that mattered. When the QRF finally arrived from the main base 50 miles away, we emerged. The base was a moonscape. Craters pockmarked the earth like the surface of a dead planet. The barracks were skeletons of twisted metal. The command post was a smoking hole in the ground. I walked out first. The air was cool now. The sun was rising, casting a pale, indifferent light on the destruction. The rescue team was moving through the rubble, tagging bodies, putting out fires. A colonel from the QRF, a clean-shaven man who smelled of soap and bureaucracy, walked up to our group. He looked at the devastation, then at us, the survivors covered in dust and blood. "Report," the colonel barked. "Who was in charge here?" Miller stepped forward, but before he could speak, the colonel looked at the crater where the CP used to be. "Lieutenant Vance," the colonel said, shaking his head solemnly. We found his tags. It looks like he was coordinating the defense until the end. A tragic loss. He'll be recommended for a Silver Star. He held the line. My stomach turned. Acid rose in my throat, burning hot and bitter. He held the line? He was the reason the line was broken. He was the reason half the platoon was dead in their bunks. I felt a surge of indignation so strong my teeth ground together. They were building a statue for the butcher. They were praising the man who almost killed us all, while the man who saved them stood there covered in dirt, invisible. It was the ultimate final insult of the military machine. I opened my mouth to speak, to rage, to tell him the truth. But a hand gripped my shoulder. It was Hayes. He stepped in front of me, facing the colonel. He looked different, older, harder. "Begging your pardon, Colonel," Hayes said, his voice steady, cutting through the morning air. "But Lieutenant Vance didn't coordinate the defense. Lieutenant Vance is the reason we were exposed." The colonel blinked, taken aback. "Excuse me, Corporal." Hayes pointed at me. "Private First Class. He is the reason we are alive. He predicted the attack 3 days ago. He reported it. Vance laughed at him. Vance confined him. But he built that bunker anyway." Hayes reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. My report. The one Vance had thrown on the floor. Hayes must have picked it up before the attack, or found it in the debris. It was charred at the edges. "This is the intelligence report Vance threw away," Hayes said, handing it to the colonel. "Everything in here happened exactly as written. The only line that was held was the one this soldier built with his own hands while the rest of us mocked him." The colonel took the paper. He read it. He looked at the date. He looked at the crater. Then he looked at me. The silence stretched, heavy and uncomfortable. The truth was out, ugly and undeniable. "Is this true?" the colonel asked the group. Miller, the sergeant, looked up. He touched the bandage on his head. "Yes, sir. We'd all be dead if he hadn't dragged us in there." Vance was wrong." The colonel nodded slowly, folding the paper and putting it in his pocket. He looked at me with a new appraisal. "What's your name, son?" I looked at the colonel, then at the ruins of the base. I felt a profound exhaustion. I didn't want his praise. I didn't want a medal. I wanted to go home. I wanted to forget the look in Vance's eyes right before he evaporated. "It doesn't matter, sir," I said quietly. "It matters to the Army," the colonel insisted. "You're a hero." I looked at Hayes, then at the bunker. "No, sir," I said, slinging my rifle over my shoulder. "I'm just the guy who paid attention." I walked away from them, toward the edge of the perimeter. I needed a cigarette. I needed silence. As I lit the match, watching the smoke curl up into the morning sky, I looked back at the devastation. The command post was gone. The hierarchy was shattered. The base was destroyed. But for the first time, I wasn't. Hayes walked up beside me. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, watching the horizon. "You gonna stay in?" Hayes asked after a long minute. I took a drag, the smoke harsh in my lungs. "I don't know. Maybe. Someone has to watch the birds." Hayes nodded. "Where loyalty to the uniform ends," he murmured, quoting an old unit saying we used to joke about. I looked at the crater where Vance died, then at the men alive because I disobeyed him. "Where loyalty ends," I finished, crushing the cigarette under my boot. "Justice begins."